China will invade Taiwan within the next 3 years. Listen to many trusted sources, along with Chinese President Xi Jinping himself, and that's the impression you'll get. In his annual New Year's Eve address, Xi reiterated his oft-repeated claims that Taiwan will be reunified with China, with those claims coming on the back of constant military exercises in the Taiwan Strait in the run-up to the island nation's elections. The Stimson Center also points out many leading U.S. military officials believe that China is going to invade Taiwan at some point between now and 2027. Chief among them is General Mike Minahan, an Air Force general. In a memo obtained by NBC, Minahan says, "I hope I'm wrong. My gut tells me we will fight in 2025, referring to his belief that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent. And why wouldn't it be? China is a country that has vastly increased its military spending to the point where it now has one of the strongest armies in the world. On paper, its might far outweighs that of Taiwan, with the country being so strong that even the US would have to think twice before getting involved in the Taiwanese war." But what we see on paper may only tell part of the story. In fact, that paper is covering the cracks of a military that's in complete disarray. The fact is that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is now impossible. And in this video, we're going to answer the big question that's now on your mind. Why? To find the answer, we need to go back to December 2023, as Taiwan prepared for its upcoming elections amidst China's constant incursions over the Davis Line in the Taiwan Strait. Xi Jinping was busy doing something that's been a hallmark of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, for decades. He was conducting a purge. But this wasn't any old purge. In the past, Xi's purges, like those of his predecessors, have been focused on getting rid of the disloyal to ensure he maintains his power base. It's a tactic we've seen in totalitarian states for centuries. Stalin purged hundreds of past allies and suspected enemies when he ruled the Soviet Union. Saddam Hussein did the same in Iraq. For Xi, the purges may not always be as lethal, but they are no less effective. However, the purge at the end of 2023 didn't involve simply getting rid of officials who weren't doing a good enough job towing the party's and thus Xi's line. Instead, they focused on 9 senior military officers, at least 3 of whom were believed to be part of China's rocket force, in a move that likely foreshadows an impending punishment for those officials. Some believe the purge to be the first and will likely be a series during 2024. That's certainly the opinion of Alfred Wu, an associate professor at Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, who says more heads will roll. The purge that centered around the rocket force is not over. And the interesting thing is that this isn't the first instance of prominent Chinese officials doing disappearing acts in 2023. Earlier in the year, a former defense minister named Wei Fenghe, who happened to be former head of the People's Liberation Army's or PLA's rocket force, seemingly vanished without a trace. The man who followed in his footsteps as defense minister, Li Shangfu, suffered the same fate. He was removed from the position in October after disappearing for several months. One of Shangfu's deputies was also among the ministers purged in this most recent display of Xi Jinping's power. When asked in August why Wei Fenghe had been removed from his position, a spokesperson from China's defense ministry was abrupt in his response. The PLA has zero tolerance for corruption. And it's in these mentions of corruption that we start to see Xi Jinping's reasonings for the purges. You might have noticed that we've mentioned the PLA's rocket force several times in this video. Feng He was a former head of the group, with 3 of the 9 men purged at the end of 2023 also being high-ranking officials within the rocket force. It's supposed to be the jewel in the PLA's crown, the group that's responsible for developing the missiles that the PLA will use to not only attack Taiwan, but to bolster its nuclear threat to the point where it could rival that of the US and Russia. The shine on that jewel has disappeared. In January 2024, Bloomberg published a report claiming that US intelligence had shown several flaws in the missiles the rocket force was building for Xi. The big headline? Many of China's missiles are filled with water rather than fuel. The Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, followed up on that report with one of their own. In it, the FAS highlighted several of the claims made in Bloomberg's report. These included several missile silo lids that were apparently not fully operational, essentially meaning that they can't be relied upon to open or close should Beijing need to launch a nuclear missile. But more worrying for Xi, the intelligence suggests that several of China's missile silo fields may have components or even entire stages that are filled with water instead of rocket fuel. We don't need to state the obvious here, but we'll do it anyway. A rocket can't launch without fuel. The findings call into question practically all the reports the world has been seeing about China's growing nuclear capabilities over the last 3 years. Military modernization has been at the forefront of Xi's plans since he took office. The Arms Control Association believes that China has at least 410 nukes, with some in the US claiming it'll be up to 1,500, matching the US and Russia by 2035. These nukes need missiles to power them to their destinations, and prior to these reports coming out, China seemed to be near the top of the field in that department too. As recently as November 2023, The Telegraph reported that the US Department of Defense was working on a new intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that would be capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere, traveling enormous distances at 20 times the speed of sound before hitting the target. All of these reports are now being called into question. For years, the missiles the rocket force has been building have been a significant part of the multifaceted threat that Beijing has presented to the world. Now that we know some of them are apparently loaded with water rather than fuel, an obvious question arises: how many? Is this a case of Xi catching some of his most trusted military officials in a few isolated acts of trying to take shortcuts as they attempt to keep pace with his desire for modernization? Or is the water problem endemic to the point where it affects a huge portion of China's missile supply? We can't know for sure, but we can certainly speculate that Xi's latest purge was a direct response to these flawed rockets, especially given that a third of the party members who are now gone were part of the rocket force. More worryingly for Xi, this is far from the first instance of corruption in his military ranks, putting a damper on his ambitions. In 2015, War on the Rocks reported that corruption within the PLA had long been a subject of great interest for both the international and Chinese media. Back then, accusations of theft, extortion, bribery, and mistrust seemed to mar the military, with the general consensus being that Xi would have to get a handle on these issues to enact his modernization plans. And that's what he's been trying to do. These latest reports leave Xi with egg on his face. Not only are the missile silo lids not working while some of the rockets are filled with water, but other reports suggest that even rank-and-file members of the PLA are engaged in thievery. One ex-PLA official spoke on Radio Free Asia to claim that problems like these have existed in the rocket force for years, even claiming that the troops would steal solid fuel from Chinese rockets to, of all things, cook hot pot. He reasoned that the troops have so few supplies that they needed something with which they could cook. The official even claimed that soldiers could simply walk into an armory and ask for a small round piece of solid fuel, which was supposed to be used in the missiles so that they could cook. As funny as this story might appear, it seems to show the rocket force wasn't doing enough to keep its troops stocked up with the far simpler fuels and equipment they need for cooking. Did she simply not assign enough money for basic provisions? Or has that money ended up going to places it shouldn't have, leaving his troops to make stew of meats, vegetables, and other foods using literal rocket fuel? It likely isn't the former, which suggests the rocket force isn't running as it should. All of this adds up to a simple conclusion: China's rockets may not be as ready to launch in the short term as many believe them to be. It would take a lot of hot pots to account for the missing fuel. Clearly, there's a far bigger problem that Xi's trying to solve with his purges, but when it comes to using those flawed rockets in the short term, it looks like he's out of luck. And that brings us neatly to Taiwan. In April 2023, Reuters reported on China running military drills. Lasting for 3 days, these exercises began when the Taiwanese president returned from a visit to the United States, essentially making them a warning: this is how we might attack your island. What's important here is to think about the nature of those drills. Taiwan's defense ministry reported that along with several air sorties, the drills focused on how China might conduct precision missile strikes against Taiwan in the event of an invasion. On its WeChat account, the Chinese military shared a short animation that emulated the attacks the country was simulating during the drill. The video shows missiles being fired from the land, air, and sea directly into Taiwan, suggesting that a large part of China's strategy would be to unleash a missile barrage on the island nation. This is far from the only simulation that assumes China will use a missile barrage on Taiwan. In August 2023, the RAND Corporation ran its own wargame simulations under the assumption that China's approach would be to launch a massive barrage of missiles at Taiwan as part of their invasion. Before implementing any of its proposed solutions, RAND's game saw the US losing over 100 of its 5th-generation aircraft due to missile strikes. RAND then lowered that to about 50 losses after implementing an array of countermeasures. The solutions aren't the key point here. It's the assumptions about China's approach to Taiwan. Missiles, missiles, and more missiles. Are you starting to see the problem here? The recent purge, along with Bloomberg's revelations, show that corruption appears to be endemic in China's rocket force. We know that several of its missiles are compromised, either because they're launching from faulty silos or they're not launching at all. due to being filled with water instead of fuel. If China's approach to Taiwan is going to be missile-focused, Xi absolutely cannot feel confident in the strategy that he's been so carefully developing over the last few years. Missiles may no longer be an option for China. At the very least, they won't be an option until Xi can find trusted people to not only inspect the missile stores that he was waiting to hit Taiwan with, but also replace the missiles that have been subject to such rampant corruption. All of these checks will take time, and that's time that Taiwan can use to strengthen fortifications and deepen its alliance with the United States. And speaking of the US, all the time that China will have to waste on checking its missile stocks allows America to build a stronger presence near Taiwan. The country already announced plans to build 4 new military bases in the Philippines in April 2023, including a naval base and an airport. That'll allow it to oversee what's happening between China and Taiwan from a strategically advantageous location. China can ill afford to launch an invasion once those bases are completed. That's why it needed to strike within the next few years to have the best chance of succeeding while invading Taiwan. But now Xi can't rely on the missiles he planned to use to do the job, because for all he knows, those missiles may not even be capable of launching. And if launching could be a problem, who's to say that stalled missiles might not detonate and wreak havoc on China's own military bases? The result is Xi would have to cut the missiles out of his Taiwan strategy. Still, that leaves him with a pretty powerful navy and an increasingly modernized air force, plus China has far more ground troops than Taiwan, over 2 million active personnel versus Taiwan's 215,000. So perhaps a ground-based invasion would be an option. But therein lies another problem for Xi. If he can't trust his missiles, can he trust anything else in the military? He'll know that he has working boats and planes. He's been running drills with them in the Taiwan Strait for most of the latter half of 2023. But learning that so many shortcuts were taken with his missiles will lead to more questions. Were similar shortcuts taken with anything else? Will our planes fly as long as they should? Can our subs launch torpedoes and missiles reliably? The single instance of corruption in the rocket force could be the tip of the iceberg that Xi and his comrades are just beginning to unravel. His purges are supposed to be a measure to prevent this type of corruption. They're the message he sends to his government. Fail me and suffer the consequences. But purges are nothing new in China, meaning they weren't a deterrent for the most recent rocket force members who were purged. Who's to say that this latest purge will do the trick? Questions upon questions now exist, which is the last thing Xi will want if he's gearing up to invade Taiwan. He needs to know that every strategy he deploys and every piece of equipment his forces use will work the way it's supposed to. After all, China spent hundreds of billions of dollars on modernization. Xi can't go into a Taiwan invasion lacking confidence in the fruits of all that spending. But if he were to invade in the next couple years, that's exactly the situation he'd face. Xi clearly isn't confident in his military. That's the key takeaway from his purges. But that lack of confidence creates another issue, regardless of how well-founded it might be. Every purge damages morale. Imagine how it might have felt to be a high-ranking military officer in the wake of Xi's December 2023 purge. The odds are you're not thinking about formulating strategies or making sure your small part of the military is functioning correctly at that moment in time. You're worried, fearful of your leader, and worst of all, you've just watched as people who might have been your friends or comrades have disappeared from command. The focus will switch from who the military should target next to who Xi will target within the military. And if you have a whiff of the corruption that Xi is looking for around you, odds are you might be next. Christina Chen, who works at the Taiwan Institute for National Defense and Security Research, or INDSR, as a research fellow, thinks that morale will be a major issue for China going forward. Speaking to Al Jazeera, she says, more removals might follow, and that could further weaken the morale of the military and its ability to fight. The mention of ability to fight here is critical. Shaking up at the highest levels of the chains of military command causes reverberations that are felt at every level. The lowest soldier may not know much about why Xi is conducting his purges. China likely isn't going to be telling its troops about the issues with its missiles, but they'll feel the impact caused by leadership changes as they create uncertainty in the ranks. What may have been a well-oiled strategy before is now mired in confusion. New people ascend to leadership positions. They may clash with the officials who managed to keep their jobs, and those new people also need to learn fast. All the while, Xi might focus on conducting more purges, not just to weed out corrupt members of his military, but to ensure that his people are forced into loyalty. That brings us to another problem. Xi may be focused more on loyalty than invading Taiwan right now. China is struggling economically for the first time in years. Youth unemployment rocketed up to 21.3% in June 2023, a record high during Xi's time in charge, after which the Chinese government announced it would no longer be publishing that particular statistic. The country's property market is in shambles thanks to many of China's leading developers taking on so much debt they can no longer pay it back. And as for manufacturing, which employs 18% of China's workforce, global demand is slackening due to other players entering the industry and Xi's own Made in China 2025 policy. These are all massive problems for Xi. For years, he's been able to rely on China's economic prosperity not only to strengthen the country's military, but also ensure loyalty from its people. Sure, fear has always played into his strategy, but Xi has positioned himself as the figurehead of a new, stronger, and more prosperous China, which has seeped through to many aspects of the nation. Now that there are such major economic problems in China, Xi can no longer rely on the economy as a way to build loyalty. Hence his purges. If you can't make them loyal by providing good times, make them loyal through fear. The problem with this approach, beyond that fear is creating resentment, is that Xi has to move his focus internally. That's what we've seen with these most recent purges. Rather than being able to focus on how he's going to use his missiles and other equipment to invade Taiwan, he now has to concentrate on ensuring his own military does what he tells it to do. Add to all of this a simple fact: Taiwan isn't an easy nation to conquer. If it were, China would have done it decades ago. After all, merging Taiwan with China has been on the Chinese agenda since the days of Chairman Mao, but it's never happened for several reasons. One, and perhaps the most prominent, is that Taiwan has generally been bolstered by support from the United States. We discussed this earlier when discussing America's new bases in the Philippines. Though the US hasn't made a definitive commitment to sending its military in if China launches an invasion, Xi will know that war with Taiwan risks bringing the US into the fold. That is a big enough problem when he felt confident in his missiles. Now it would be suicide. Second, Taiwan's geography makes it extremely difficult to invade via land. Mountainous terrain runs through the island's center, with Taiwan recognizing that bunkering down in these regions will make it very hard for China to take over. Sure, Xi might be able to land troops along Taiwan's 970 miles of coast, but whether those troops could be effective is another question, especially when Taiwan has mountain bunkers, such as its hidden Chiashan Air Base, from which it could fend off Chinese attacks. So Beijing would have to rely on a coordinated attack involving planes, ships, and missiles, bringing us back to the rocket force's corruption. And there are other issues. The Taiwan Strait is usually a choppy passage of water, largely thanks to a pair of monsoon seasons that hit the strait each year. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, a seaborne invasion is only possible for a few months every year, further shortening the window of invasion opportunity for Xi. China has to cross the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan only has to defend itself. The thousands of troops that would be required to get the appropriate numbers of troops onto the island would take several weeks to make the crossing. All the while, they'd be battered by Taiwanese defenses and potentially American forces. And even if those ships managed to land, they'd be limited to parts of Taiwan's coast that have ports. Taiwan would have the option of destroying those ports, making them useless to China. Should China get past all of that, it would then have to engage in urban warfare, fighting street by street in a drawn-out conflict that would be far from the smash and grab that many envision an invasion of Taiwan to be. And that's why Xi favored the missile barrage he had the military simulating in early 2023. That barrage isn't possible anymore. At least it's not possible to launch it with the level of confidence Xi needs to have in his military to devastate Taiwan from afar rather than landing on the island. So an invasion of Taiwan likely isn't in the cards for Beijing anymore. It can't trust its missiles, and the strategy it intended to use is out the window. But what do you think? Is this a temporary reprieve for Taiwan, allowing it to fortify while China rebuilds? Or is China's missile problem not as big a barrier to invasion as it seems? Tell us what you think about the missiles and Xi's purges in the comment section below. And check out why China's artificial islands are now sinking. Or watch this video instead.